We're going to see a play in a moment by Robert Johannson, who's visiting us from Winnipeg. This year has been the 100th anniversary of the Winnipeg General Strike, which is a very significant event in Canadian history that many of you may know a lot about, and some of you are about to learn a lot more about. So without any further ado, Robert Johansson's Systems of Control.
Ottawa, 1926. It was cold, January cold. It's a wet cold in Ottawa, it chills right to the bone. So you're probably wondering why a letter from a Liberal Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, hangs on the wall of the caucus room of the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. January 1926. We had just had an election, and A.A. Heaps and I had been elected as representatives of the Independent Labour Party from Winnipeg. Now, Mackenzie King was still Prime Minister with 100 seats, but it was a minority government. The Conservatives had 115 seats, and the balance of power was held by the Progressives with 22 seats and a few independents, and of course Mr. Heaps and myself. Now, Mackenzie King had lost his own seat, so he was a Prime Minister without a seat in Parliament and without a parliamentary stipend. His financial situation was dire. He had to pay the expenses of the Prime Minister's office out of his own pocket, even his secretary's salary. But he was determined to continue as Prime Minister and to present a speech from the throne to Parliament. The Conservatives would move a motion of non-confidence, and if the speech from the throne was defeated, the government would fall. Since Mackenzie King's future was hanging from such a slim thread, Mr. Heaps and I decided that it would be singularly appropriate and indeed timely if we were to write Mr. King a letter. Dear Mr. King, as representatives of Labour in the House of Commons, may we inquire if it is your intention to present at this session A, relief for the unemployed, B, old age pensions. We are endeavoring to send a similar inquiry to the Leader of the Opposition. Yours sincerely, J.S. Woodsworth, A.A. Heaps. Now, King invited us to dinner. There were 4 people at dinner that night. There was King, myself, A.A. Heaps, and the editor of the Ottawa Citizen. Now, we said grace, and Mr. King was very clear and at pains to impress upon me, a Methodist minister, that he was himself a very religious man and had even considered going into the ministry. Now, in this effort, he was slightly mistaken, because Mackenzie King believes in a spiritual afterlife, whereas I myself believe that the kingdom of God that Jesus was talking about is the same as the cooperative commonwealth that the socialists speak of. So in a word, he was religious, but I am not. Nonetheless, I was inclined to think well of King, because the 2 of us were part of a small group of English Canadians who had opposed conscription. We were in Laurier House. King had bought Laurier's house as a sign, a public sign that he was a Laurier liberal and that he intended to be Laurier's successor. Well, Laurier Laurier, during the Great War, had opposed conscription. He was a French Canadian, and he knew that the people in Quebec had no interest in the war in Europe. And so, to use the power of the state to force men to give their lives in a cause they considered of no value and of no interest, that was simply wrong. So he had opposed conscription, and King had stood with him. He had stood with him. And so the people of Quebec respected King, and I respected King. But it cost him his seat in Parliament, and he was forced to go to the United States to find work. Now I believe that the teachings of Jesus are absolutely incompatible with the advocacy of war. There is no redemption in physical force. The only way to permanent peace is through the development of goodwill. The war was the inevitable product of the existing social structure with its undemocratic forms of government and its competitive system of industry. Now, at the time, I was working for the government at the Bureau of Social Research, a position that had been created specifically for me. And so I tried to avoid the war. But there came a day when a request came on my desk asking me to support registration, which was the first step to conscription, and I could ignore the issue no longer. I wrote a letter to the Manitoba Free Press outlining my reasons for opposing conscription. 2 days after the letter was published, I was called on the carpet by the minister. I was to be given a chance to be good. In other words, to keep quiet. Now, I come from a long line of dissenting clergy, and we will suffer many things, but we will not be silenced. And so, I was fired. Now, the church appointed me to a small mission at Gibson's Landing in BC. And I went there hoping to avoid the conscription issue. But it was impossible. If it had been a problem in the government, it was even worse in the church. The war fever was everywhere. There was no dependence on spiritual forces. Retaliation specifically repudiated by Jesus was advocated. Military necessity was used to cover a multitude of sins. So, I offered my resignation. And it was gladly accepted. When I had differed on matters of doctrine or discipline, I had been talked into remaining in the ministry. But when it came to matters of politics, I was out. It was extraordinarily painful for me. My associations, my education, my work, my friends, my ambitions had all been connected with the church. It was like an amputation. So, King and I had suffered for opposing a popular war. Now, I was inclined to like King, and on the other hand, I was not particularly inclined to like Arthur Meehan. You see, Arthur Meehan had been the acting Minister of Justice in 1919 during the Winnipeg General Strike. So, while Mackenzie King in 1919 was becoming the leader of the Liberal Party, I was being arrested for seditious libel. Now, of course, it is an honor to go to jail when you are fighting for social justice. And I got a telegram from the Federated Labor Party in Vancouver. It said, "Congratulations on your martyrdom. Hope you deserved it." So I kept the spoon from jail as a reminder of that time. Now, I came to Winnipeg just as the strike was in its 4th week, and I thought that maybe I could help with some sort of settlement. I started off, I went to a meeting of the Labor Church in Victoria Park. There were 10,000 strikers there. It was like a great revival. There was a passion for justice, a sense of brotherhood, a commitment to serve and to sacrifice, and a dependence upon the God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. I had been fighting for social justice all my life, in the church, in missions, and in the government. But I will never forget the passion for social justice that I saw that day. Now, though I tried to be some kind of bridge and get some kind of reconciliation, it was impossible. There was a general hysteria, and that was the method of the enemy. They had one strategy, which was fear, and it had 3 tactics: lies, violence, and legislation. They tried to frighten people with lies, and they did. They portrayed the strikers as foreign Bolsheviks, funded by vast quantities of Russian gold, and determined to establish a Soviet state by armed force. My mother knew people in River Heights who were guarding their homes with rifles against these imaginary Bolsheviks. So I knew that I had to tell the truth. I had to tell the truth about what the strike was about. The strikers were striking for an 8-hour day, a 40-hour week, and a minimum wage. Well, the voice of the strikers was the strike bulletin. And when they arrested Bill Ivins, they thought they'd silenced the strike bulletin. But my friend Fred Dixon said to me, "JS, you be editor. I'll be the reporter." And we kept the strike bulletin going, and we told the truth. We told the truth even about the violence. Because when the lies failed, they turned to violence. And we told the truth about the violence, about Bloody Saturday. June the 21st, the Returned Soldiers Committee had called for a silent parade to show their support for the strikers. By 2 o'clock, a large crowd had gathered in front of City Hall. And at 2:30, a group of 54 Mounties appeared riding down Portage Avenue. The constables in their red jackets, the officers in khaki, and the constables carrying baseball bats. They turned onto Main Street and increased their pace and charged into the crowd, swinging their baseball bats. The crowd parted to let them through and then closed in behind them. They wheeled on the other side of City Hall and they charged again. Only this time, when they got to the other side, there were two riderless horses. They rode down Main Street, turned, and this time there were no khaki uniforms. This time they had drawn revolvers. They rode down to William Avenue and they fired into the crowd. And they rode around William Street, around City Hall, and they fired another volley into the crowd. And they charged to the Confederation Life Building, turned on the crowd and fired a third volley. And they were just turning to fire another volley, but the crowd had broken and fled. 26 people were shot. 2 were killed. 2 were killed. And then the specials came out, dressed in civilian clothes with white armbands and carrying clubs. And they began to attack the crowd, what was left of it. They trapped 200 people in Hell's Alley and they attacked from both sides. And they injured some 30 people, seriously. So that it was all over by the time that the soldiers from Fort Osborne Barracks arrived, carrying fixed bayonets and driving trucks with machine guns. So we told the truth. We told the truth about Bloody Saturday. To use the mounted police as a political goon squad is detestable. It was murder. The violence didn't work. The lies didn't work, and the violence didn't work. I have become more and more aware of the limitations and the dangers of physical force. So when the violence didn't work, they turned to the third tactic, which was legislation. They passed a law saying that a person in the criminal code could be accused and they would have to prove themselves innocent. They changed the Immigration Act so that they could deport any immigrant as an undesirable. The legislation was rushed through. In 1 hour it went through Parliament, the Senate, and was given royal assent. Their plan was simply to take the strike leaders and deport them without any trial or without even a hearing. But of course, most of the strike leaders were from Scotland and England. So it was a great outcry, and they were forced to charge them with seditious conspiracy. I, of course, was charged with seditious libel for publishing the strike bulletin. Now, I never actually went to trial because they were too embarrassed, because the evidence they had against me of seditious libel was that I had quoted the Bible, the prophet Isaiah. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness to prescribe that they take away the right of the poor of my people, that they may make widows their prey and rob the fatherless. So I never went to court. I never went to trial. But the strikers did. and most of them went to jail. Most of them were convicted. My colleague, Mr. Heaps, was one of the few that were acquitted. So that legislation was iniquitous. It should never have been passed. So the spoon that I brought with me from jail is now attached to my parliamentary pen wiper to remind me that I'm not here to play the game. I'm here to change the rules. Now, King, listen to me talk about the Winnipeg General Strike and talk about that legislation. And he insisted that he would introduce legislation to repeal those sections of the Criminal Code and the Immigration Act. Not only because he thought they were repulsive, which he did, but also because he saw the extent to which I cared about it. Now, King found the personal relationship profoundly important. And he had invited Heaps and I to come to dinner, to have a conversation, to share, and to discover the ways we were really similar in our ideas and in our experiences. Now, Heaps and I had come to the dinner with an agenda of relief for the unemployed and old age pensions. But Mackenzie King had something a little bit more. He wanted me to become his Minister of Labor. Now, Labor, the Department of Labor, was King's creation. He had started it from nothing and built it up. And he cared, he insisted that he cared more than anything else about the plight of working people. His great line was, "The voice that is heard above the chaos and noise of the modern world today is labor demanding a fuller and freer life." Now, what did that mean, a fuller and freer life? To Mackenzie King, it was systemic. Our system of industry is feudal in nature. Companies and people are bought and sold on the open market. So just as our system of government has evolved from a system of feudalism to a system of democracy, so that same evolution has to take place in industry. Now, I, on the other hand, I saw the problem as a question of ownership. Ownership means control, and control with a specific purpose, the maximization of profit. Now, a system, an economic system based on private ownership and a competition for the means of life is going to result in monstrous inequalities and social and spiritual degradation. The only way to democratize industry is social ownership and control. King, of course, was not so optimistic about government. He trusted the owners because he had worked with the owners, specifically with John D. Rockefeller Jr. When King had gone to the United States to find work, he went to Harvard University, where he'd gotten his PhD in economics. And the president of Harvard introduced him to John D. Rockefeller Jr. And Rockefeller convinced the Rockefeller Foundation to give him a grant to study labor relations and also to write his book, Industry and Humanity. But it was the relationship to John D. Rockefeller Jr. that made me suspicious of King. Because if the Winnipeg General Strike was the most scandalous labor dispute in Canada, the Ludlow affair was the most scandalous labor dispute in the United States. 13 people were massacred at Ludlow by goons in the employ of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. So King went to Ludlow, but he did more than study labor management relations. He took Rockefeller under his wing and he taught him. He taught him first that he was, as the owner, he was responsible for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, and he would have to intervene personally. So they went to Ludlow. And King also believed deeply in the personal relation. And so Rockefeller met with the labor leaders, the union men. And he even was dancing with the miners' wives. He had them eating out of his hand. Even that radical union activist, Mother Jones. Even Mother Jones. Now to King, it was the change in Rockefeller that made the difference. He had learned from Jane Addams at Hull House in Chicago that change comes from within. External pressure leads to resistance. Real change has to come from within. Now, King was inviting me into the cabinet. In the cabinet, I could be a voice for change. I could advocate for the kinds of changes that both King and I wanted. It was, to King, a question of power. He was offering me real power. Why had I come to Ottawa? Not to spout theories, but to make change happen. And real power is not a magic wand that makes things happen. It is a process of coalition, cooperation, and even compromise. Had we not been willing to negotiate with Arthur Meehan in order to get good legislation? But where do you draw the line between being practical and selling out? Now, I knew the unwritten rule that when a man enters the cabinet, he must sink his own personal opinions and speak with the voice of cabinet. In other words, I would have to keep quiet, but I could not keep quiet. I had lost a government job that I dearly loved. I had resigned from the church. I had even gone to jail because I could not keep quiet. If I kept quiet, I would be betraying the people who elected me, because we who have studied the issues and have special knowledge, we must speak out. He wasn't offering me power, he was offering me impotence, the appearance of power without the reality. Real power comes from telling the truth. Many years ago, I took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and I stood on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane and looked across to Jerusalem, the holy city, and the gleaming dome of the rock. There, the temple had been. There, the Roman Empire had ruled with an iron fist. There, Pontius Pilate had said to Jesus, "I have the power to crucify you." And Jesus had replied, "I came to bear witness to the truth." As I attempted to adjust my beliefs and my manner of life in accordance with realities, there came to me with new force that the sacrifice of Jesus must be completed and repeated in the life of each true believer. So I decided that what may, I must be true to my convictions of truth. I must be sincere at any cost. And I was given an inspiration, a moment of inspiration that I have sought to follow my whole life. So, I told King that I could not be his Minister of Labor. King accepted my decision with regret and promptly asked A.A. Heaps if he would be Minister of Labor. Heaps also declined. Mackenzie King then insisted that he would give us a letter that would promise to introduce old age pensions and relief for the unemployed and repeal those sections of the Criminal Code and the Immigration Act that Arthur Meehan had put in during the Winnipeg General Strike. And that is why a letter from a Liberal Prime Minister hangs on the wall of the caucus room of the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in Ottawa.
So how did you come to write and put this together?
Well, I'm from Winnipeg. You got to write a play about the strike if you're from Winnipeg. The other thing that interested me, the reason it took this particular form, was I was fascinated by the question of Wordsworth. He's a fascinating character. And a puzzle, because he does all these different things. And what was the theme that ran through all of it? How could you make sense of all the different things that Mackenzie King had done? And the play is a way of talking about that central inspiration, to be sincere. The thing about Wordsworth was whatever people thought about him politically, they admired his sincerity. When the Second World War was declared, I think Parliament declared 2 days after England, Wordsworth was the only person voting against the war. And everybody was okay with that because they knew he was sincere. He had no political motives. He had no outside agenda. He was doing what he thought was the right thing.